Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Here we are again with the novel Great Expectations. Today we would start exploring the text of this novel. We would look at the story. We would do a textual analysis and critical discussion on the important parts of the selected chapters of Great Expectations. Before I move forward, I would like to share quickly a review of the previous lesson. Well, in the previous lesson, I introduced you to the novel that you are supposed to study now, that is Great Expectations. The author of Great Expectations, Charles Dickens, was also introduced. I talked about his birth, his early life, and his underprivileged or unprivileged background in which he lived during the early years of his life. I also talked about the struggle that he had to do for making his career, starting as a teenager working at a shoe factory where 12 hours out of a day he would be labeling the labels on the polish bottles or packs. This was his early life. However, he was determined to make his fortune, so he struggled hard. Through his journey from a journalist to an editor of different newspapers, and finally his success as a novelist shows his determination. After introducing you to Charles Dickens, who is the author of the novel, I also gave you some introduction to the times when Great Expectations was written. As far as the setting of the novel is concerned, I also shared it with you in which background and in which kind of geographical setting the novel is set. Genre and form of the novel was discussed. It is important to understand the novel that you know in which form and following which genre it is written. So we had discussion on that. Plot and structure of the novel and Charles Dickens' mastery of constructing plot was also discussed. Mainly, I discussed with you how there are three clear-cut divisions in the novel. Phase 1 deals with the protagonist Pip's life in the countryside, the life that he lived in that small village or town, under the supervision of Mrs. Jo Gargery, the elder sister of Pip, and in the benevolent and friendly support that was provided by the brother-in-law Joe. The second phase shows the development of his expectations, and in pursuit of these expectations he moves to London as he gets some fortune from some unknown source. And the third phase shows his disillusionment, and as he is disillusioned and he realizes that his great expectations are false, he makes his journey back from the city of London to the very small town or village from where he started his journey. Thus the whole cycle is completed in terms of plot and structure. I also introduced you to the major themes of the work, and I also told that as you would move through the text, we would incorporate these themes with reference to different extracts of the text. So you would see how we work on that in today's session. I introduced you to the major and minor characters also because I believe a pre-hand knowledge of these characters would facilitate your reading of the text independently. As far as the novel is concerned, well, as we are going to start exploring the text of the novel today, it is important to understand the structure of the novel. How would we explore the novel? Well, the novel is divided into different volumes or into different books. We would look at these volumes, and under each volume we would look at different chapters, and at the outset of every session you would be told how many chapters would be covered in a particular session. So in today's session we would start part 1 of the novel. Moving through the text of chapters 1 to 7 of part 1, we would see the development of the character of Pip. In doing so, we would explore important themes with relation to the text. We would discuss the development of other characters. We would also critically analyze what is presented and what is the purpose of presenting that, as Dickens writes that. Discussing points to ponder, we would have a critical analysis of the text that we would look at. With this, we start chapter 1 of part 1. Well, the story of the novel opens with the narrator Pip, who introduces himself and describes an image of himself as a boy, standing alone and crying in a churchyard near some marshes. Young Pip is staring at the gravestones of his parents who died soon after his birth. This young shivering boy is suddenly terrified by the harsh voice of a man who threatens to cut Pip's throat if he doesn't stop crying. The man is dressed in a prison uniform with a great iron shackle around his leg. He grabs the boy and shakes him upside down, emptying his pockets. A piece of bread falls from the pocket of Pip, which the man starts devouring at. This shows that he is hungry. Answering the questions of the convict, Pip tells him that he is an orphan and that he lives with his sister, Mrs. Joe Gargrey. He also tells him that Mrs. Joe is married to a blacksmith who lives about a mile from the church. As he provides this information to this man, the man tells Pip that if he wants to live, he'll go down to his house and bring him back some food and a file that he wanted to use to cut the shackle on his leg. Pip is, of course, very much frightened, and he agrees to meet him early the next morning, and the man disappears in the marshes. Well, talking of the setting of the novel and the setting of the opening scene, you can see that it is the countryside area, it is the dull, dumb area of marshes where there is deterioration everywhere. Ironically, the first scene in which Pip is introduced as a very young boy, this takes place in a graveyard. The early stages of the life of Pip can be seen in contrast to the graveyard setting, where you see people, after passing through all the hardships and bitternesses of life, finally reach. With relation to this first chapter, there are some important points to ponder that I would like to discuss with you. Dickens gets right to the action. Within the first few paragraphs, he has introduced the main character, that is Pip. He has given the location of the story, as I have discussed earlier, and he has revealed that Pip is an orphan with 5 dead brothers, and he also introduces the conflict. That is, there is a convict who is in need of help and who gets hold of Pip and wants him to help him by providing him food as well as a file. As far as the setting of the scene is concerned, it is a bleak place overgrown with nettles, dark flat wilderness, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it. True rustic rural background with all its dreariness and with all the wilderness around. Dickens introduces us in detail to Pip, who serves as both the young protagonist of the novel as well as the story's narrator, looking back on his own story as an adult and now narrating it to us. Well, here comes in Dickens' mastery as a writer. With this two-level approach, Dickens leads the reader through young Pip's life with the immediacy and surprise of a first-person narration, while at the same time guiding with an omnipotent writer or narrator who knows how it will all turn out. Because after all, this narrator Pip has gone through all this, and now he's looking at all this in retrospect. The adult narrator Pip will foreshadow future events throughout the story by using signs and symbols very cleverly. The choice of the retrospect first-person narrator is effective because the reader immediately feels part of an intimate and confessional conversation where we as readers would expect Pip to confess his rights and wrongs, strengths and weaknesses, everything that he did. Well, Dickens uses this duality to great effect in the first chapter, where we are personally introduced to Pip as if we were in a pleasant conversation with him. Here are some words that he says. I give Pip as my father's family name. Immediately after this, however, we are thrown into the point of view of a terrified young child being mauled by an escaped convict. Critically looking at all this, another thing that is important in this chapter is Pip's name. This is something that I am quoting from the text. My father's family name being Pip and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip and came to be called Pip. Well, this shows Charles Dickens' knowledge of child psychology, his knowledge of human psychology, that is reflected in how Pip's name is coined. Another important thing that needs to be noticed in this chapter that sets the basics or the very background for the whole story, we need to see the relationship between Pip and the convict. At first, the relationship appears to be based solely on power and fear. The man yells at the boy only to get what he wants, that is a file and some food. On the other hand, the boy only responds for the fear of his life. It is out of fear that he promises that next morning, early morning, he would come with the demanded things. And yet after they part, the young Pip is shown looking back at the man as he walks alone into the marshes. A new kind of relationship, a different dimension of the relationship is hinted upon. The image of the man holding his arms around him alone on the horizon, save a pole associated with the death of criminals, is strikingly familiar to the initial image of young Pip holding himself in the cold, alone in the churchyard with the stones of his dead parents. For a moment then the relationship seems to be warm. They share a common loneliness and a common marginalization from society. And here comes in the theme of social discrimination and marginalization. Whereas Pip is a victim of all this, despite whatsoever the convict does, he too is a victim of the same. So as they share a common loneliness and a common marginalization from the society, the orphan and the escaped convict, while he is afraid, Pip instinctively displays a sympathetic reaction towards the convict. The question at this stage arises, what will this meeting lead to? Well, this initial meeting between a small boy and a convict will develop into the central relationship in the book. It is the relationship which will cause Pip's great expectations for himself to rise and fall. So Charles Dickens as a writer has laid the stones, foundation stones I would say, for his story from the very beginning, and he has actually incorporated the main theme and the main storyline from the very beginning into his text. With this we move on to chapter 2 of part 1. Pip runs home to his sister, Mrs. Jo Gargery, and her husband, Mr. Jo Gargery. Mrs. Jo is a loud, angry, nagging woman. She believes in raising by the stick, and this is how she has raised Pip. She constantly reminds Pip and her husband Jo of the difficulties she has gone through to raise Pip and take care of the house. In these times of tension, it is Jo who offers refuge and solace. In fact, he is more of an equal and a friend than a parental figure. Under the tyrant rule of Mrs. Jo, they are united. Again, the relationship that Pip and Jo has, it would go a long way through, as we would see while reading the novel. Pip has the thought of stealing bread on his nerves that he has promised to provide to the convict. So during the dinner, Pip nervously steals a piece of bread. Early the next morning, Pip steals some food again and a pork pie from the pantry shelf and a file from Jo's forge that he is supposed to provide to the convict. Then he rushes back to the marshes to see the convict. So action is taking place very quickly, and in the second chapter of this part we see that the theme of child abuse is also established. The reader's sympathies once again are directed towards Pip, who not only lost his parents but is being raised by a raging, bitter woman. A common criticism inherent in many of Dickens' novels is the abuse of children in society at large. Although he paints Mrs. Joe in a rather humorous light at times, the reader is still keenly aware of the fear in which this poor child grew up. Well, with reference to this chapter, we have a few critical points of analysis that we need to ponder about, especially that is Dickens' art of characterization. With the convict's use of W's in his words, wittles instead of victuals, and the convict's eating style similar to that of a large dog snapping up mouthfuls and watching for danger, Dickens defines the convict's social class, his educational level, his current life situation, as well as his feelings about that. The description of Mrs. Gargrey, that is Mrs. Joe, as having a heavy hand that she uses much on Pip and her husband, as well as Pip's description of his sister's method of buttering his bread and getting pins from her bib stuck in the bread, tell a great deal about her nature, how her marriage works, and what Pip thinks of her too. It is Dickens' art of characterization that paints the pictures of the convict and Mrs. Joe in front of our eyes. He is such an artist who, with the words, paints pictures that are far more clear than the pictures that are painted with colors or that are drawn with pencil. Continuing on Dickens' art of characterization, here is a sample part of text from this chapter that is a description of how he presents his characters. Pip is the narrator who says, "My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony and almost always wore a coarse apron fastened over her figure behind with 2 loops, and having a square impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made it a powerful merit in herself and a strong reproach against Joe that she wore this apron so much." So we can almost visualize Mrs. Joe. This leads us to chapter 3 of part 1. Let's see what happens in chapter 3. The next morning, Pip quietly leaves the house and reaches the marshes. He finds a man, wet and cold and dressed like a convict. However, it turns out that the man is not the same convict who had threatened him the night before. Rather, he is another convict. This man has a badly bruised face and wears a broad-brimmed hat. We need to remember that these are going to be important clues for certain identities as well as happenings in future. Anyhow, he runs away from Pip without speaking to him. Pip finally finds the convict whom he had met earlier and gives him the food and the file. As the convict files at his shackle, Pip leaves him and returns home. Here are a few points to ponder that we can have a critical analysis of, and what is important here is the theme of relationships. With reference to the relationship of Pip and the convict, it can be noticed that their second meeting shows that their bond is strengthening. Pip looks at the convict in a more sympathetic light than the first. Pip even puts away his fear to say, "I'm glad you enjoy it," as the convict eats. Since he stole the food and file, Pip is now the convict's partner in crime and feels closer to the man. So this theme of relationships leads to the theme of guilt as well. Great Expectations has some elements of mystery and suspense. In this chapter, we see these elements at work as well. Dickens uses secrets as a way of heightening suspense throughout the novel. Partially the reason is that originally the novel was published in episodes, as I have discussed in the previous session, and Dickens had to retain the interest of the readers to persuade them to buy the next magazine. Well, how the theme of secrecy is at work in the novel. In Dickens' work, suspense is created as someone is always hiding something from someone else. Sometimes these secrets are clear to the reader, and the reader is a partner in crime with the characters, as we are with Pip as he sneaks around his house, terrified of getting caught, stealing food, stealing the file, and taking these things to the convict. Other times the reader is left out of the secret, but we are given the impression that it is an important thing that we need to find out. This, of course, generates curiosity in the reader, as in the case of the two convicts. The reader is not told who the other person, the other convict is. We know that there is some connection between the two that is important to the story, but we are given very few clues to help us. And as curious readers, we need to keenly find further clues in the upcoming chapters. Well, before we move forward, I think it would be a good idea to share a few important insights that cover from chapters 1 to 3. These chapters introduce several themes such as relationships, love and fear, right and wrong, good and evil, justice and guilt. You would have noticed that some of the themes are what I already have presented and have briefly discussed in the first session on this novel. Some of the themes are new that you would see how they are incorporated in the text. Pip's strange relationship with the convict is also established. His relationship with his sister and brother-in-law is also established, which leads to the theme of love and hatred, or also the theme of relationships. Pip struggles with the wrong of stealing for a convict and the good of caring for a suffering human being. He also feels guilty for just being alive. He also feels guilty for stealing. From infancy, his sister has never let him forget he owes his existence to her. He is saturated with this guilt, and this theme of guilt would continue throughout the novel. Well, to provide you some more insights into the theme of guilt, here I have some part of text as an evidence. The mist was heavier, yet when I got out upon the marshes, so that instead of my running at everything, everything seemed to run at me. Well, I would like to explain that here Charles Dickens, as a writer, as a very, very masterly and very, very skillful writer, he has used images to create the environment that he wanted to convey to the reader. The symbol of mist that he has used, you know what mist does. Mist चीज़ों को cover कर देती है ना, fog जो होती है वो चीज़ों को cover कर देती है. When you have mist, you cannot see things clearly. Your vision is hampered. So the mist was heavier, we are told. चीज़ें clear नहीं हैं, चीज़ें साफ नज़र नहीं आ रही. The vision is not clear. This is what we are told. Yet when I got out upon the marshes, so that instead of my running at everything, everything seemed to run at me. अब ये कौन लिख रहा है? ये डिकन्स लिख रहा है. लेकिन कौन बोल रहा है? This is the narrator. ये story बताने वाला. Who is the narrator? Pip, who is now a grown-up man. He is recalling his memories of that day, when he was a young child and when he was experiencing all this. And what he says is that instead of my running at everything, everything seemed to run at me. The image clearly depicts the fear of young Pip. This was very disagreeable to a guilty mind. The gates and the dikes and banks came bursting at me through the mist, as if they cried as plainly as could be, "A boy with somebody else's pork pie. Stop him." The cattle came upon me with like suddenness, staring out of their eyes and steaming out of their nostrils. "Hello, young thief!" One black ox with a white cravat on, who even had to my awakened conscience something of a clerical air, fixed me so obstinately with his eyes and moved his blunt head around in such an accusatory manner. Sorry, यहाँ से दोबारा करूँगी. In such से. in such an accusatory manner as I moved round that I blubbered out to him. I couldn't help it, sir. It wasn't for myself, I took it. Upon which he put down his head, blew a cloud of smoke out of his nose, and vanished with a kick up of his hind legs and a flourish of his tail. So the whole scene, the whole imagery that is used to create the scene depicts one thing, that is the theme of guilt. It is the guilty conscience of the young Pip that makes him feel as if everybody, all the animals, everything around, from the gates right to the dikes and the banks, everything was just looking at him, and everything was shouting it out that he was a thief and he had stolen something. Well, these chapters are also important in terms of writing style of Charles Dickens. Humor and satire are important tools in these chapters as well. Pip, for example, always calls his parents by the only names he knows: Philip Perrep, late of this parish, and also Georgina, wife of the above. His deceased brothers are described as the 5 little stone lozenges. Even Pip's politeness to the convict, requesting to be held right side up and expressing delight that the convict enjoys the stolen food, are funny. A bit of satire shows up when the stick used to beat Pip is referred to as the tickler. In order to see the art of characterization of Charles Dickens and his ability to develop his characters, let us see some text. This is about the convict. He was gobbling mincemeat, meat bone, bread, cheese and pork pie all at once, staring distrustfully while he did so at the mist all around, and often stopping, even stopping his jaws to listen. Some real or fancied sound, some clink upon the river, or breathing of beast upon the marsh. I had often watched a large dog of ours eating his food, and I now noticed a decided similarity between the dog's way of eating and the man's. The man took strong, sharp, sudden bites, just like the dog. He swallowed, or rather snapped up, every mouthful too soon and too fast, and he looked sideways here and there while he ate, as if he thought there was danger in every direction of somebody's coming to take the pie away. He was altogether too unsettled in his mind over it to appreciate it comfortably, I thought, or to have anybody to dine with him without making a chop with his jaws at the visitor. In all of which particulars he was very like the dog. Now narrated from the point of view of the grown-up adult Pip, and experienced from the point of view of the young Pip, we can have the whole description of the character of the convict. As we read the description and the way he eats, the way he looks around, the way he is terrified, and the way Pip compares him to the large dog that he has seen at his place, at his sister's place, eating food in the same way exactly this man eats, we can almost imagine the convict with all the fear that he has of being caught up, that he is quickly eating the food, he is just gobbling it up. Well, dear students, this leads us to chapter 4 of part 1. In this chapter, what we see is that Pip returns home to find Mrs. Joe preparing the house for Christmas dinner. As she is busy and is in a cross mood like always, she keeps pushing Pip and Joe out of her way. Pip is very much tensed with whatsoever he has been going through. He fears that his theft will be discovered any moment. When Joe asks him to go with him to church, he is relieved to accompany him. As far as the sister, Mrs. Joe, is concerned, she has invited various people. She has invited Mr. Wopsle, the church clerk, Mr. Hubble, the wheelwright, and Mrs. Hubble and Uncle Pumblechook. So dinner is a nightmare for Pip for various reasons. Let's see what happens. The table is in his chest, Pumblechook's elbow in his eye, and he's served the scraps of food no one wants. Again, Dickens has given us a clear picture of the themes of fear, the theme of love and hatred, the theme of relationships. It is the fear and the guilt that the table is in his chest and Pumblechook's elbow in his eye. He is under a lot of pressure, and what he is served are the scraps of food no one wants. This shows the nature of relationships that he has with people around. It is only one character, that is Joe, who is of some solace. The discussion over dinner was how fortunate Pip should feel about being raised by hand by Mrs. Joe and how much trouble she has gone through in that endeavor, though Pip's opinion was never requested. So the situation becomes ironic when in that troublesome situation, under all that pressure and being physically and emotionally abused, he is served the scraps of the food that nobody else wants, but at the same time on the table where people are taking dinner, the discussion goes on that it is the very kindness of Mrs. Joe who has raised him and who has raised him by hand. However, Pip's opinion, of course, that would not be on the, same wavelength, is never asked by anybody. Well, continuing part 1, chapter 4, I would say that the fear that he might be caught up any time makes the dinner a nightmare for Pip. Every time he thinks that that is Mrs. Joe, will find it Pip, sentence ko dobara karenge. Every time he thinks she will find it, Pip clutches the table leg in nervousness. When the moment passes, he releases it. Again, child psychology and the knowledge of child psychology on the part of Dickens is clearly evident here. Mr. Pumblechook nearly chokes on some brandy after the meal, and Pip realizes that he poured tar water in the brandy bottle when he stole some for the convict. Of course, this adds to his nervousness now. Mrs. Joe becomes too busy in the kitchen to afford a full investigation of what has happened to the brandy, but then announces that she is going to present the pork pie. Pip remains in tension through the whole incident, and though this tension increases or decreases every moment in the context of what was going on the table, however, now it reaches its height when finally his sister announces that it is the time for the savory pie. She's talking of the pie Pip gave to the convict, actually. Sure that he's going to be caught up, Pip jumps from the table and runs to the door, only to meet face to face with a group of soldiers standing in their doorway, holding handcuffs, who appear to be there to arrest him. Here the imagination of the child is at work, and as he finds some policemen standing there with handcuffs in their hands, he is sure that they are there to arrest him. From a critical analysis point of view, there are certain things that we need to think about. Number one, the themes of fear and guilt. It is again the theme of guilt that makes Pip feel that the policemen with the handcuffs holding in their hands, they are there to arrest him. Suspense and theme of suspense is also present there. The suspense grows in this chapter as the reader and Pip fearfully await the discovery by Mrs. Joe of the things which are missing from the kitchen. The apprehension is kept light, however, with a foolish dialogue between the adults over how much trouble Pip is to raise for Mrs. Joe. This also becomes ironic. Relationship of Pip and Joe as a social commentary is very important. Amongst all the characters, the only sympathetic character is that of Joe, who continues to make gestures of support towards Pip while all this discussion on the table goes on. Dickens' little social commentary here is clear. It is often the dim-witted and poor, a person like Joe, who would act with more grace and charity than wealthy, loud mouths such as Mr. Pumblechook and Mr. Wopsle, who claim that they do so. Before we move forward, I would like to say that this again reminds me of Joseph Andrews, as we have read, that was written by Henry Fielding. Their help would always come, true sympathy and sincerity would always come from the lower class people, the less privileged people, and here again Joe is a representative of the same class, and true sympathy for Pip comes from him only. He is the only sincere character. Some other emerging themes are of relationships and child abuse and religion. Well, when it comes to relationships, we need to see two sets of relationships. One is of Pip and Mrs. Joe. The other is Pip and Mr. Joe. And the third set of relationships is Pip and the guests. Amongst all these three sets, I would say, it is only Pip and Mr. Joe who have a positive relationship, who are supportive to each other, who have some sincerity in the relationship. As far as the relationship of Pip and Mrs. Joe is concerned, she has always thought of him as a burden. She has not only thought of that, she has always conveyed this to Pip at each and every stage of life. When it comes to the relationship of Pip and guests, this is the relationship of the powerful to the powerless, of the privileged to the unprivileged. These are the people who make loud claims, but when it comes to consider on human grounds, they are not able to consider Pip on the humanitarian grounds and to consider his misfortunes. This leads to the theme of child abuse and religion. Child abuse and religion were often targets of Dickens' satire. The adult's attack on Pip about the young never being grateful degenerates into the ridiculous when Mr. Wopsle and Pumblechook turn a conversation about pigs into a Sunday sermon and moral lecture for the young. The satire continues as Pumblechook takes great delight in describing what a butcher would do if Pip were a pig, and then telling Pip how lucky he is to be with them. In the so-called humor that actually leads to satire, the humor that Pumblechook thinks he is creating is very bitter actually and very satirical, and it reflects upon how cruel sometimes people can be towards others. All this incident, all this happening also refers to Charles Dickens' understanding of child psychology, how this example of a butcher and what he would do with Pip if he were a pig, all this example, how it would have affected the young innocent heart of Pip at that stage of life is a crucial question that is indirectly raised. Well, another theme that is very significantly present in the text is that of injustice of social classes. This is another theme that emerges in these chapters, and Pip's convict is willing to forfeit his freedom to bring the other one back. There is mention of the second convict getting easier treatment because he is a gentleman. It is obvious there is a history between these two, and their fight foreshadows darker conflicts to come between them. And this is what we would see in the upcoming chapters. So far, how masterly Charles Dickens has presented characters. To demonstrate his skill in the art of characterization, here is again an example of an extract of text that is about Pumblechook. It is written, Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish, dull staring eyes and sandy hair standing upright on his head, so that he looked as if he had just been all but choked and had that moment come to. With this description of Pumblechook that helps us visualize him very clearly, we come to the next chapter, that is chapter 5 of part 1. Well, it turns out that the soldiers are not there to arrest Pip or anybody from the company. They in fact need a pair of handcuffs fixed by Joe. They are invited in to take some food and drinks. Mr. Joe starts repairing the handcuffs in the forge. We also come to know that these policemen are in fact hunting two convicts who were seen recently in the marshes. After Joe fixes the handcuffs, he, Pip and Mr. Wopsle are allowed to follow the soldiers into the marshes. They soon find the two convicts wrestling each other in the mud. The one with the hat accuses the other, Pip's convict, of trying to kill him, but the other replies that he would have done it if he really wanted to. Instead, he had been the one who had called for the soldiers and was willing to sacrifice himself just so the one with the hat would get caught again. They bring the two back to a boat. They bring the two back to a boathouse where Pip's convict, eyeing Pip, admits to stealing Mrs. Joe's pork pie by himself, thus getting Pip off the hook. Again, a strange kind of relationship is seen being established between this convict and Pip. The reality is that Pip stole the food and the file for him and provided these things to him in the marshes. However, the convict, as he notices the nervousness of Pip, he, eyeing Pip, admits to steal these things personally. This shows his sympathy towards Pip. This also brings them together once again on the same level where both of them are socially marginalized. They are not only socially marginalized, but also they are able to identify each other as the victims of society and as marginalized people. If you remember the sympathy of Pip in the very beginning, when he provides food to the convict and when he asks whether he likes it or not, shows that Pip's looking at the shadow of the convict as he moves away, and now the convict's reaction to all this and his very act of admitting that he himself stole the pork pie from Mrs. Joe's pantry, all this shows the relationship. Well, as a master of plot construction, we can say that Dickens has also foreshadowed here that maybe in future this relationship would grow further and would be established into a far stronger relationship. Joe and Pip anyhow watch as the two convicts are brought back to the prison ship. Well, there are some important points of discussion with reference to this chapter. The first one is the theme of suspense, the second is of relationship and secrecy, and the third theme is that of social injustice that I would like to talk about. Moving towards the first one, that of suspense. The reader is presented with the question of why the two convicts are fighting with each other. Pip's convict goes so far as to say that he deliberately got himself caught, just so he could make sure the man with the hat would go back to prison. What is the reason? What hatred did this man have that would make him go back to prison just to see another suffer as well? These are the questions that create suspense in the heart of a keen reader. Again, partially the purpose of creating this suspense is because initially the novel was published in episodes, so to generate interest in the readers to buy the next copy, this was a tactic that Charles Dickens used. As far as the theme of relationship and secrecy is concerned, relationship between the convict and Pip continues to grow as well. Even though they do not speak and the convict hardly looks at him, we can notice that he eyed him and he claimed that he himself stole the food. The convict obviously wants to protect the boy and, suspecting Pip may be threatened, takes the blame for stealing the pork pie. The two are once again united in secrecy. This theme of secrecy would continue through the whole novel. The last theme with reference to this chapter that I would like to discuss is the theme of injustice. Pip's convict is willing to forfeit his freedom to bring the other one back, and there is a mention of the second convict getting easier treatment because he is a gentleman. It is obvious that there is a history between these two, and their fight foreshadows the darker conflicts that would come between them in future, and that I have already talked about. Well, dear students, this leads us to the next chapter, that is chapter 6 of part 1. What happens in this chapter? Let's see. Joe, Pip and Mr. Wopsle walk back home. Pip decides not to tell Joe the truth about his file and the pork pie. In fact, he fears losing this friend and is frightened of losing his respect in the eyes of Joe. When they return, the topic of discussion is the question of how the convict managed to get into the locked house. Mr. Pumblechook doesn't know anything, yet through his bombastic overbearance, Mr. Pumblechook's arguments wins when he claims that the convict would have crawled down the chimney. However, finally Mrs. Joe sends Pip to bed and Pip is relieved. Important points to ponder are with relevance to the theme of fear and guilt again. Pip's fear that Joe would think worse of me than I was if Pip told him about the file and pork pie refers to the theme of fear. The theme of fear recurred throughout the novel. In the personal life of Pip also this fear revisits again and again. Joe is the only friend in the world for Pip and Pip decides to hide the truth from him because Joe is very dear to him, and even more dear is his friendship with Joe. He is not only a human being, he is not only a relation, he is not only a guardian, he is his entire family, he is his entire society. Pip fears to lose this companionship by telling the truth. In the future, Pip will struggle with telling the truth because of the fear that society will think less of him. So, a lot of foreshadowing about the actions and reactions of Pip is done here by Charles Dickens. Anyhow, the emerging themes through these chapters so far are of need, insecurity, abuse, secrecy, good and bad, or you may call it right and wrong, cowardice and guilt. The themes of need, insecurity, abuse, good, bad, cowardice and guilt show up in Pip's interactions with Joe. Pip loves Joe very much, mostly because Joe lets him love him. Joe is about the only good thing Pip has in his life, and at the age of 7, Pip cannot afford to lose the love of the only gentle adult around him. Therefore, Pip says nothing about the food and the file he stole. Pip suffers a lot of guilt, but he prefers secrecy, emotional distance, and sacrificing the truth to losing love. Pip, the older narrator who now is narrating the story, judged himself by admitting he was a coward at that moment and he couldn't share the truth. These themes would recur through the book. With this we come to chapter 7, that is the last chapter that we would cover in today's session. What happens in this chapter, let's see. Mrs. Joe is a very hard-hearted sister, and as Pip is not old enough to be apprenticed in the forge yet, Mrs. Joe has decreed, she has given the order that he is not to be pampered, that is to be pampered more. She sends him to do odd jobs and keeps all the money that he gets, that he earns through that. Pip, as a narrator, describes a little of his education with Mr. Wopsle's great aunt as well. She was a ridiculous old lady who had started a small school in her cottage. However, mainly the basic education of Pip is done by somebody else, and as Pip describes, it is less than satisfactory that is taught by this old lady, but Pip does learn some basics from Biddy, who is an orphan girl and who works for Mrs. Wopsle. Again, sincerity and help comes from the lower class and from a poor girl, an orphan girl, Biddy, who is a representative of the unprivileged. While doing his homework one night, Pip discovers that Joe is illiterate. Joe tells the story of his life. He explains that he never stayed in school long because his father, who was a drunk and who was physically abusive to him and his mother, kept him out. Joe finishes the story by telling Pip how lonely he was after his parents died and how happy he was to have Pip's sister join him at the forge. Well, Pip has doubts about his sister's behavior, so he is very skeptical about that, but Joe is firm on this, and Pip is overwhelmed with gratitude to Joe for taking him in as a baby. Well, chapter 7 goes on. We come to know that Joe goes on to explain to Pip that because of his father, Joe stays humble to Mrs. Joe. I'm dead afraid of, now look at the language of Joe. I'm dead afraid of going wrong in the way of not doing what's right by a woman, he says. He lets Mrs. Joe rampage over him because he sees how difficult it is to be a woman. Remembering his own mother, he wants to do the right thing as a man. Pip has a new understanding and he develops far greater respect for Joe. At this point, Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook return from a shopping trip with good news that Pip is to be sent to Miss Havisham's to play with her daughter. Miss Havishams, who lives in Satis house, is a rich and grim lady who lived in a large and dismal house that is called, as I said, Satis house. Uncle Pumblechook is actually the person who is the key figure in this arrangement, and he suggested Pip to Miss Havisham when she asked if he knew any small boys. So Pip was to go tomorrow and spend the evening at Uncle Pumblechook's own town, and there he would stay and he would be sent to Miss Havisham's then. Well, a critical analysis of the chapter shows that this chapter marks a key turning point in the novel. The second phase of Pip's learning is about to start. This phase takes Pip from his young childhood in the humble company of Joe to the beginnings of greater expectations in the company of higher society. As Pip would go to Miss Havisham's place, we would see that new relationships would be established which would lead towards new and far greater expectations. And in pursuit of these expectations, Pip would move from the countryside to the city of London. The chapter also presents a relationship between Joe and Pip which is growing in love and respect. Two important things that I would like to mention with reference to this chapter are, number one, the theme of class distinction, and number two, Dickens' art as a writer. As far as the theme of class distinction or class discrimination is concerned, Joe is at the bottom of the social hierarchy and particularly at the bottom of his household hierarchy as well. But Pip finds new respect for his position. And as the adult narrator Pip says, I had a new sensation of feeling conscious that I was looking up to Joe in my heart. The image is almost ideal. The young Pip and Joe sitting next to the fire, Pip admiring him and teaching him the alphabet. So they are a support system for each other. Well, as far as Dickens' art as a writer and his mastery of his control over what he writes is concerned, I would say Dickens contrasts this humble setting with the opportunity presented at the end of the chapter by the noisy entrance and rather insolent announcement by Mrs. Joe. She introduces the first of Pip's great expectations in the form of the job given to Pip to play for Miss Havisham. Now this play would turn out to be very ironic later on. This boy's fortune may be made by his going to Miss Havisham's. This is what is announced. Although little is known about the wealthy woman and less is known exactly how Pip is supposed to play, we so far do not know much as readers. The opportunity is one where Pip will be in the company of a higher social and economic class of people. So it relates to the theme of class distinction and upward social mobility. Well, with this we come to the end of today's session. I would quickly share a summary of today's session. We started the analysis of Great Expectations, the novel. We moved through the text of chapters 1 to 7 of part 1. We explored the themes. We also discussed the development of characters. We critically analyzed the text and we saw how the threads of plot and themes are run through the text. We discussed several important points from the critical point of view as well. I hope so far you would have been able to understand what Dickens has presented in the first 7 chapters of part 1. And this is a list of references of the works consulted and incorporated. Presentation with this I come to an end. Thank you very much.